evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Association Latino Spotlight. So, in honor of Black History Month, I've got an extra special guest for us, and we're going to be talking about Tuskegee Airmen, and in particular, Clayonia's grandfather, whose name is William Augustus Colbert Jr. Clayonia and I have met each other in 2019. She's my dope sister. We're both part of the Diversity Executive Leadership Program by ASAE. And so we want to talk to you a little bit about the Tuskegee Airmen, give you some perspective on the historical aspect and the significance of the Tuskegee Airmen. We'll talk about the lack of diversity in the military during that time and the relevancy to modern or contemporary issues. And then we'll talk about the impact and the legacy of Tuskegee Airmen and what that means, what we can learn from that. So as I mentioned, Clayonia Colbert-Dorsey is my dope sister, and she is the manager of continuing education provider services at ASHA, otherwise known as the American Speech Language Hearing Association. You may have seen Clayonia. She's gifted with the gift of gab. She is a global speaker and presenter. She's presented at the African Society of Association Executives, their annual conference. She's spoken at ASAE's Ignite, ASAE Annual, and the One Retinoblastoma World, just to name a few. Welcome, Clay. How are you?
Thank you. Good morning or afternoon, depending upon when is watching this. Thank you so much, my brother Carlos. I appreciate you and Association Latinos for reaching out, not just because it's Black History Month, but because I think that the story of the Tuskegee Airmen and those like them is American history, 365 days a year, particularly with the current times that we are living in as America continues to reflect on the state of racial relations right now. And so I just thank you for wanting to have this discussion and share insights in terms of what I know about the Tuskegee Airmen and their experience, and more importantly, as the eldest grandchild of William Augustus Colbert Jr.
Yeah, thank you, Clay. So I was thinking about this and in terms of Black History Month, but as you said, American history. As a Marine, I love military history, and I know I've heard you speak about this enthusiastically. So I'm like, I've got to talk to Clay, and I've got to have her share her story with the association community. So I appreciate you, and I thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we have that whole history thing in common because, my husband is a Marine, and lots of people in my family come from that military background. So we share commonality in many areas.
There's definitely a bond among, Marines and, I'll say,
yes.
Military in general.
Yes.
So talk to us about, your grandfather, and if you can tell us where he grew up.
Absolutely. So my grandfather was the youngest of 5 children. Okay. 3 girls, 2 boys. He was the baby of the family. There was like 20 years between his eldest sister and himself. They were born and raised in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, in Annapolis, Maryland, which is actually the state capital for those of us here in Maryland. He actually was the grandson of a freed slave. His father's mother was a freed slave, and what our family history details is that his father's father was the slave master. And it's very interesting because I've seen pictures of my great grandmother, and she was very, very dark. And then when you see his father was very, very light with blue eyes. So Carlos, you and I were talking earlier about our DELP orientation experience. And one of the lines that I used as part of our orientation and introduction was that I am the hope and the dream of a slave. I truly see myself in that manner since our family history has that record that this is what we extend from. And more importantly, when I think about my grandfather, the fact that the grandson of a freed slave, went on to become a Tuskegee Airman, one of the first Black aeronautical aviators, fighters in American history. And throughout his life, he said he always wanted to fly. So he truly was able to live out his dream by being able to avail himself of Tuskegee when that opportunity presented, and just make so many in his family and in his community proud. He was a graduate of Wiley Bates High School in Anne Arundel County. After his high school graduation, he worked in the Baltimore shipyards for a period of time. Then he availed himself of the Civilian Conservation Corps and worked with that effort. And then when World War II came around, he was able to enlist, and because of the training that he received as part of the Conservation Corps, he was able to apply to the Tuskegee program and was one of the fortunate few to be accepted for the training program.
That's incredible. Being able to trace your family's history back, and being descendants of a freed slave, kind of going all the way to your grandfather's story of being a Tuskegee Airman. So you touched on it. He enlisted and he was not drafted, correct? So I don't know if you know this, but did he contemplate other branches, or the Air Force, Army Air Force was always something? And I think you touched on that.
I think he has said that ever since he was a little boy, he wanted to fly. So I think he probably gave no thought to any other branches of the service. He heard that they were looking for aviators, and he, I'm sure, probably said, I'm going to apply to the Air Force. In order to be considered for the Tuskegee program, you needed to have at least 2 years of college. So again, through his training with the Conservation Corps, he was able to qualify for that. You had to pass both health screenings as well as educational screenings. Another interesting fact is that you had to have permission of your parents and be between the ages of 18 and 24, and unmarried. So if you could pass all of those hurdles, then you could be considered as a potential candidate for the Tuskegee program.
And now tell us, where did he go, and where did he get training, flight training, when he enlisted?
So it was not, Carlos, we were talking about this earlier. Tuskegee was not initially the training hub. It eventually became the training hub, but it was not initially the training hub. Prior to World War II, there had been a push in the African American community for there to be more African American pilots. Bessie Smith was a very early female aviator. There were some other early aviators. And so there was an interest in the African American community to expand Blacks who were flying. Some Black newspapers. I know there was a publication out of Pittsburgh, the Afro newspaper out of Baltimore, Maryland, and the NAACP then started community drives and sort of publication campaigns to let's get Blacks involved in aviation. Eventually, a student from Howard University petitioned the American, some facet of Veterans Affairs, which it wasn't called back at that time, but some facet of Veterans Affairs to be allowed to be admitted to flight school. And that was approved. And then from there, they started a what they initially called a civilian air training program. And they started programs at 5 or 6 different historically Black colleges and universities. Howard was one of them. Delaware State was one of them. North Carolina A&T was one. West Virginia State University, and Tuskegee. Tuskegee, as I said, eventually became the hub. my grandfather received his training at Tuskegee.
Now, do you know, I don't know if you, maybe some historical facts, but in terms of how many people tried to apply, right? And maybe they said, hey, there's a need in World War II. I think you said 961 were, eventually selected for the program.
Right. So 961 were actually trained according to the studies that I have done. Of that 961 that were actually trained, approximately 450 or so actually participated in the combat theater in Europe. My grandfather was trained, he was alerted twice to go overseas to Europe and actually fight. The first time his alert was called back, there wasn't a need. The second time he was alerted, and then before he actually shipped out, the war itself ended.
Okay. So that was right around 1945.
Right.
Are there any significant stories that you might be able to share? Maybe your grandfather and just the Tuskegee Airmen in general?
I think the interesting thing, probably for most of us who may be listening to this recording, I know as a child growing up, I did not learn about the Tuskegee Airmen as part of my history lessons. And my grandfather was one. My grandfather was from the era that you didn't necessarily talk about what it was that you did. He didn't see himself as doing anything special. It was what he was called upon to do as an American. And I know that's an attitude that many Tuskegee Airmen held. What they represented in history, they really were the first pioneers to pave the way for desegregation in the United States Air Force by virtue of what I think is truly their bravery. They went into uncharted waters, and even when they entered into the Air Force, what they dealt with, it was still during a time of segregation. So their journey was coupled with the angst of what that meant. There has been debate as to whether or not is it the Tuskegee Experience or is it the Tuskegee Experiment. I choose to look at it as a Tuskegee Experiment because what a lot of people don't know is that the thought of trying to teach African Americans to fly came out of a 1925 War College study. And they wanted to try to refute or see if it was possible to refute what that study postulated. The thesis of the study was that African Americans were mentally inferior, that they were socially inferior, and that they should only be used in service roles, no other roles other than service roles. So the thought of them being able to fly an airplane was very much taboo. So the push was, let's see, let's do this, let's see what happens. And now we can look back in historical reflection and see the fruits of the labor. And I think, which Carlos, I think you're going to touch on, some of the major generals who were selected to come in and lead the program, they realized the importance of the mission. They knew that they needed to hold the men together. They knew that they were up against a system that wanted them to fail. And if they did fail, that was not only a letdown to them, but I think a letdown to all persons of color in America who were looking for this experiment or this experience to make a difference and pave a way, which ultimately I think it did.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that, and we talked a little bit about this, but if you go back to the Great War, World War I, you had a distinguished, I'm not sure if it was a battalion or company of African Americans from Harlem, known as the Harlem Hellfighters. And so they went to, in support of France, to fight off the Germans. And they worked closely with, French units. And, interestingly, that when they came back, they told the story of they felt totally accepted, which was, outside the normal of, the segregation that they felt and the discrimination in the United States. So even though they spoke different languages, French and English, they were able to make the connections. And again, they distinguished themselves, above and beyond on the battlefield. I believe the entire unit was awarded the French Cross, the Croix de Guerre, I think it's called. So, there's a long history of African Americans, contributing to American fighting for that flag, right?
Right. Yeah. I guess that's just, there's so much talk about, and this is not the point of our conversation,
Sure.
but I think it holds relevance. There's a lot of talk happening right now about critical race theory. And what does
Sure.
critical race theory mean? And should we talk about it or should we not talk about it? Part of it is these chapters of history that we don't know about. So you had experience and exposure with the Harlem Hellcats, which I didn't really know anything about. I think about the Buffalo Soldiers. There is a very strong connection between the Buffalo Soldiers and the Tuskegee Airmen in terms of throughout history, they see each other as common spirits. My words, not necessarily their words, but they see a connection between the roles that they each played. The Buffalo Soldiers in the French American Indian War, Tuskegee Airmen in World War II. But historically, we don't typically know a lot of this. We have not had this exposure. And so part of my passion and part of what I want to be able to continue to do is ensure that, at least until the day that I draw my last breath, unfortunately, most of the surviving Tuskegee Airmen are in their very late 90s, some in their early 100s. They're passing away. And in their passing away, the stories are going with them. And I think to lose their legacy, to lose their light, is a disservice to ourselves and our country. So I want to continue to try to champion that mission and keep it alive. I'm thankful that my daughter, it's a story that she's wanted to pick up on and continue to carry forward with her. And we just need to continue to keep all of these very important stories in history out there and part of the narrative, particularly when we're reflecting on how we can use examples such as this to try to improve upon what's happening in society today, where we can learn lessons, where we can glean for having impact.
I just want to touch base a little bit on what you said earlier. So, your grandfather did not have an opportunity to go to Europe, right? And because of the war ended in 1945. So how long did he serve? And, what did he do when he came back home?
So my grandfather just, did the regular military stint, 4 years,
4 years?
6 years. Yeah. He did not want to become a career military man. I was sharing the story with you earlier that my grandfather was a proud man. He also he didn't tout his own horn, so to speak. So he has a box of memorabilia, and I just happened to be visiting with he and my grandfather one day, or my grandmother one day, and started going through the memorabilia. And that's when I sort of discovered all of the Tuskegee information and this Tuskegee materials. But one of the things that I found among his graduation program, his original graduation program, his flight records with the number of hours that he had flown, his test. Interestingly, I don't want to lose this train of thought, but interestingly, I found a test where it was very, very clear that he had scored 100% on this test, but most, if not all, of the flight instructors were Caucasian. And so even though he scored 100 on this test, they only gave him 95 out of 100.
Oh, wow.
And it was because they did not want to acknowledge the fact that an African-American man could score 100 on this particular flight test. So they didn't want to record he had actually achieved 100.
So he actually aced it, but wasn't
Right.
given that due credit.
Exactly. Which I think was probably typical. But in terms of what he did, he's getting hundreds on flight test when it became apparent that he did not want to continue to serve in the enlisted branch. He was given a letter of reference, and that letter of reference was written that he could come back to the Baltimore area, to the Annapolis area, and that he would be excellent serving as a store clerk. And I looked at that letter and I couldn't believe it. Here's a man who's been flying planes, and you give him a letter of reference to recommend that he be great as a store clerk. He didn't follow that route.
Sure.
He ended up marrying my grandmother, and my grandmother was from the mountains of Western Maryland, Cumberland. And so he moved to Cumberland and actually became a tire builder with Kelly Springfield Tire Company, which was very big at that time through probably the late 70s, early 80s, and worked there for the rest of his life until he retired in his late 50s, early 60s, and then just lived comfortably, fishing and hunting and growing gardens.
Now, I want to go back again, if I can, just to kind of touch on the legacy of Tuskegee Airmen. And you had shared a story of the Germans and the intelligence, that they had gathered on Tuskegee Airmen, and in particular, somebody who was shot down and, became a prisoner of war. So I see part of that as the Germans, doing intelligence, but also the fear factor of the Tuskegee Airmen. So they had to study their, opponents to know a little bit about them. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that.
There was a Tuskegee Airman who was actually shot down in Europe, and he was captured by the Germans. And he became a prisoner of war, and he was interrogated. When they brought him in for his first interrogation, he's sitting at the table, they're posing questions. To his shock, they present him with, somehow the Germans have managed to get a hold of yearbooks, some type of files. They proceeded to show him pictures of every single class of Tuskegee Airmen going through training. Before they even brought him in the room to be interrogated, they knew who he was, they knew what his name was, they knew where his hometown was, and they proceeded to show him, we have this information on all 961, or however many men it was at the time that he was captured, who are going through this training program. And that just totally blew my mind, because I think it does speak to what was the level of intelligence that they had and what was going through the minds of the German, that they felt that it was that critical to not perhaps necessarily have this intelligence on the Caucasian pilots, but the need to have it on these Black flyers.
Yeah.
Black pilots.
And I think that speaks to kind of, how elite of an outfit they were, right?
Yes.
In terms of, escorting bombers and, again, just putting fear in the enemy and their opponents.
Right. Right. And that is one of the hallmarks of what they did. They flew a lot of bomber escort missions where they were at the front lines guiding the bombers in and flying cover so that the bombers could get position where they needed to be, and never lost a single bomber plane on any of their missions. I think that's really historically significant. I also shared with you, Carlos, that when my grandfather died, he died in 2015. And at his wake, we had the son of a World War II Caucasian pilot who did not know my family, who did not know my grandfather, but he had a lengthy obituary that was in the local newspaper. And he just wanted to come and pay honor to our family and to my grandfather. And he said that his father, in telling him stories about World War II, told him stories about the Tuskegee Airmen and how courageous they were, and how they really looked out for the Caucasian bombers and getting them to where they needed to be. And this man felt like, as a result of that, I think in perhaps in honoring his father, he just wanted to come and pay his respects to our family in the memory of my grandfather.
Now, as the Colbert family, how do you keep your grandfather's legacy alive today?
By opportunities such as this. Uh, Definitely. He is probably the hallmark showcase person of our family. We're proud of him. So it's not just me, but it's cousins, who, whenever they have opportunity to talk about him, want to go out and want to help tell his story and the story of Tuskegee Airmen. My daughter has competed in a number of pageants and held a number of different titles. It ended up that in later life, my grandfather developed Alzheimer's. And so my daughter has taken on the moniker of Alzheimer's awareness, and using my grandfather and his story as a way to help elevate the platform of Alzheimer's awareness. Being involved with organizations that want to champion the Tuskegee story, like Tuskegee Airman International. Yeah, answering the call whenever it arises to share the
Sure.
story.
And I think it's important again to keep that family, that with that legacy, right, alive
Yes,
in the family. So the way you can do that is to continually tell the story to others, right? Because
absolutely.
not in the textbooks, it wasn't in the textbooks back then, and so a large portion of, I'll say, the American population don't really know about that. They don't
Exactly.
know too much about it besides the headlines.
Exactly. Exactly.
Um, so if you think about, your kind of role in associations now, and maybe your leadership experience, do you see any correlations in terms of, the leadership that was demonstrated, by the Tuskegee Airmen back in World War II and kind of, modern times? I think you touched on servant leadership.
Yeah, servant leadership is one of my passion areas. The very first time I actually got to speak at an ASA annual was in your town in Chicago. ASA 18 was my first speaking opportunity, and the title of my presentation was Leadership Lessons from a Tuskegee Airman, because I see just a number of correlates between servant leadership and the Tuskegee Airmen and the role that they played in World War II. They had vision, they had character, they were resilient and resilient building. They exercised accountability. They mentored one another along in very difficult circumstances. It was definitely incumbent upon them to exercise critical thinking skills and to have vision. Um, I think all of that ties into what's important for servant leaders. When you listen to interviews of certain Tuskegee Airmen, they talk about the price of freedom isn't free, which is so powerful in any American theater of war when we're fighting for freedom. But the analogy of Black men during World War II, during a time of heavy segregation, where there really wasn't freedom, where there really wasn't equality, but you put yourselves on the line for something different, to learn to fly planes and fly combat in this situation, I think speaks to servant leadership, to come back to a country where you were seen as a second class citizen. There are tales of when World War II ended and you had both the white fighters and the black fighters coming back on the same ship, but they were getting off different ends of the ship. And the white service members were getting off on this side of the ship where there were major bands playing patriotic music and ticker tape parades. Yet you had the black combat personnel getting off on this side of the ship, and they had maybe one or two horn players.
Just as distinguished, right? But it's
Right.
almost like if you look at an establishment, some people coming out the front door and others going into the back door.
Exactly.
And I
Exactly.
think that's a blemish, right, on United States history. That's unfortunate that happened. Again, being a Marine, in modern times in the 90s, serving in the 90s, a lot of that had gone away. So I think we've kind of evolved, as a
Yes.
fighting force. And so, there was a saying in terms of in the Marine Corps is, there's no such thing as a white Marine, Mexican Marine or Black Marine. We're all Marines. We bleed green.
Right. I think that's very heartening to hear. And isn't that where we want to get to with everything that we are experiencing today? That we see each other as just people, as Americans, all wanting to just live our lives and thrive, and leave a better world for those who are coming after us. I mean, that's really what it's about. There's also another saying of, and this is from an Air Force video that was on the Tuskegee Airman: "Will you be ready when your Tuskegee comes?" All of us are going to have a Tuskegee experience of some kind where you're going to have to make a choice to step outside of your comfort zone to make a difference. So you have to ask yourself, will you be ready, and can you step up and accept the challenge regardless of whatever the outcome may be? And so I think, to tie back to your question about association professionals, I feel as though we are perfectly poised to be the ones to make a difference regardless of the association that we may be involved with. I think all associations are elevating the human or the social condition at some level or another. And that's what Tuskegee speaks to, I feel.
Yep. And I'm sure you carry that inside you at all times, right? You walk around, you've got that sense of pride in terms of, I'm a descendant, and I think I've heard you talk about having, Tuskegee DNA kind of running through or coursing through your veins. So that's got to be special. I don't know if you can touch on that.
I don't even know where I came up with that, Carlos, but I do. I kind of use it as my mantra. See, I've got Tuskegee DNA. There are men who talk about Tuskegee was a certain kind of grit. You had to have a certain kind of grit, and you had to just kind of stand firm and just kind of plant yourself against whatever was going to come and roll with the punches. And you never know in life what you're going to be hit with. So I think if you can stand steadfast and strong, and I don't think that any of what I have encountered has been perhaps as difficult as what my grandfather encountered or the men who served with him encountered. So yeah, I can stand steadfast. I can do this thing.
You can do anything, Clay.
Thank you, Carlos.
So in 2007, I believe Tuskegee Airmen were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. And can you tell us a little bit about, your grandfather's experience and when he was awarded eventually the Congressional Gold Medal?
Yeah. So as I shared, I think that's really when there was this huge wake-up call about who are the Tuskegee Airmen and what did they do, and they became famous. You know, in my mind, they were always famous. To those of us who knew them, they were always famous. But America really became aware. It was under the presidency of George W. Bush and Congressman Conyers out of New York, and I don't want to name names and forget anybody. So there were a number of Black congressmen and senators who felt like, hey, we need to bring some recognition to these fighting legends, because that's what they were, and made proposals and petitions to get them awarded the Congressional Gold Medal of Honor, which is actually the country's highest civilian honor. My grandfather was a very polite man. You better, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, no, sir, with him. Very, very big on respect of seniors, but he could cuss you out really well too. And he had his opinion about certain things. He also, as I said earlier, was going into Alzheimer's. And so he did not get awarded his medal in 2007 when there were approximately 300 Tuskegee Airmen who did travel to Washington who were presented their Congressional Gold Medal. And I thought that it was such a shame. And for years after that, I said, you know, and people in our family said, Papat really deserves his gold medal and needs to have his gold medal. And how can we make that happen? And so finally I said, you know what, I'm just going to reach out to some local Congress people and see if it's possible at this juncture to even make it happen. And so I reached out to a couple of people, heard back from our state senator in Maryland, Ben Cardin, who said, Ms. Colbert-Dorsey, yes, we've verified the information that you shared with us. We verified your grandfather's service. He is a documented original Tuskegee Airman, and it would be our pleasure and our honor to ensure that your grandfather receives this medal that he worked for, that he should be bestowed upon him. So 2015, they traveled to Cumberland. My grandfather was in a nursing home at that time, and they traveled to Cumberland with his very huge, very large, you have to see it to believe it, Congressional Gold Medal. And he was presented to that with that in a fabulous ceremony. And we felt very fortunate because it was about a month after that he passed away.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You know, when you say you have to see it to believe it, how big was that in terms of the size, circumference, or diameter?
It's probably like about this big.
And
And it's
who?
about this thick.
Oh, wow.
It's very, very heavy. I've shared with you, Carlos, some pictures. If you want to share the pictures, you can share the pictures. My dad was an only child.
Okay.
So my dad has the medal now. They actually had also flown a flag over the U.S. Capitol. And so at the ceremony, my grandfather was presented with, they flew this flag, especially over the Capitol, for him to be given to him at his medal ceremony. So we were presented with that on the day he has that. We were presented with a copy of the citation that was read on the Senate floor and presented to President Barack Obama to sign, and that's in the Senate historic record. So yeah, lots of things. My grandfather, at the time of his death, he was the 5th generation. So my great niece had just had her son, Caden. Caden was like 3 or 4 months old at the time. And I said, this is 5 generations. This is something that Caden is going to be able, a story that he is going to be able to carry with him. Caden is now in the 2nd grade. He's 8, and we still talk to him about Pap, and he seems to act like he remembers Pap and that Pap was a Tuskegee Airman and he knows who the Tuskegee Airmen are. So I have no doubt that he's going to continue to help us keep the legacy alive.
And any final thoughts in terms of, again, looking back, the legacy of your grandfather, the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, looking at how segregated, the United States military was and maybe how integrated we are now. Any final thoughts on, the wide variety of topics that we've touched on?
That's a powerfully awesome question, Carlos. And we've talked about, and it's a debate. I do feel like the Tuskegee experiment, call it what you want, was one of the very first forays into diversity, equity. The huge question mark is, does it really relate to inclusion? They were brought to the dance, but did they really get to dance is the question. I think that it's an illustration of we've come very far from where we started, but there are still many miles to go and many hills to climb. And we see that happening around us today in so many different ways and situations and scenarios. There's an old gospel song, and one of the verses in it is that I don't feel no ways tired. And I think in the Tuskegee journey, although they got weary, they didn't feel tired. Until the day my grandfather died, he was up to the challenge of whatever he was facing. And so we've got some weary days that we're going through right now. But my challenge to us would be just to remember the braveness, remember the bravery, the boldness of the Tuskegee Airmen, and to always seek higher heights and look for the wind that we can find to propel our wings and how we can propel the wings of others, those who are going to come behind.
I thank you so much, Clayonia, and for kind of opening up, this part of your life, intimately and kind of sharing with the audience. And I hope, we can learn something and again, carry that legacy forward. And we work in association. So, as far as we've come, there's still a lot of work to do.
Yes.
In American society, but also in association. So as you mentioned, the diversity, equity, inclusion, the inclusion part is something we need to continue to work at.
Across all levels. And so again, that's why I thank you and Association Latinos, all of us as the family of color. We got a lot of work to do.
We got a lot of work to do.
We got a lot of work to do.
Right. We can help each other out and share each other's stories. I think that's an important piece to kind of end on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Clay.